6-page speech, and those are the couple of lines dedicated to the question of land. Very good English, but I'm not sure if it's saying much. In the 17-page speech that he delivered, under great pressure, because, of course, there were lots of divisions currently going on and interruptions that were distracting his speech. But even there, he dedicated a few lines. The pace of land reform has been slow. We must pursue with great determination the program of land reform and rural development as part of a program for radical economic transformation. Expropriation of land without compensation must be the key mechanism to give effect to land reform and distribution. But we must do it in a way that does not undermine future investment in the economy or damage agri-production. The ownership of land, and land particularly to be transferred from rural areas under the control of our traditional leaders, is being addressed with their full participation. When you listen to that and what he said tonight, where is the ANC going in this, and how committed are they to this question of land reform?
No, thank you, Tabo, for the invitation. I think we from the two speeches themselves, it's very difficult to work out precisely what actions will be taken to resolve the quagmire around land reform. What we can at least discern from it is that there is a noticeable shift from the rhetoric of 5 years ago. Because at this time, 5 years ago, the ANC's plan was to rip apart the constitution because it took the view that the problem lies with the constitution. Fast forward 5 years later, we know that there is no longer a view shared within the ANC that the problem lies with the legal instrument, in other words, with the base law of the country. But even though that is a welcome commitment that they are going to follow a constitutional model, the problem is what are the actual steps that they will be taking? So we know that in relation to the restitution program, the president gave us no details about what the first 5 years of his administration as head of the ANC have produced. In other words, how much actual land has left hands of white people to hands of black people? We've got to get into grips with that practical question. He also gave us no details about how much land has been redistributed. In other words, how much has been acquired by the state from the private sector for purposes of benefiting small-scale black farmers, for purposes of productive use of the land. He also said nothing at all about another perennial problem, which is tenure security. In other words, how far is the progress in relation to strengthening the rights of rural communities over the land? And yet, the greatest problem that we have had in the 5 years of President Ramaphosa's ANC presidency has been around Ingonyama Trust. Yeah. And that problem of Ingonyama Trust is about the fact that under colonial and apartheid systems, Africans had very limited tenure to the land. So on the three main programs in relation to land reform, we actually are completely blank about what happened in the last 5 years.
So let's take that last one. When he says this question of rural land and transfer of rural land that is owned by traditional leaders is being addressed, I always ask myself a question when President Cyril Ramaphosa says the matter is being addressed. What does he actually mean when he says the matter is being addressed? And where are we? Because, of course, as you're saying, this has been a hotly disputed point as far as his tenure has been concerned.
Yes, what we know about so-called rural land or communal land, that we are primarily talking there about land that is in the areas that were previously known as the TVVC states, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, Ciskei. Obviously, we include KwaZulu, Kangwane, Gazankulu, all of the homelands and Bantustans. There were about 10 of them. Now, what we know under the colonial system is that the order that was instituted by the British was that native people had no rights to individual land ownership. And that order was constructed on the basis of this notion that individual land ownership does not exist among Africans. Land is therefore communally owned. But precisely because the British claims that communal ownership is not ownership, they used a strategy to deny ownership at all. Now, what that meant is that native people occupying land had no concrete rights, and there are primarily three ways of relating to the land. The first is access. The second is exploitation. And the third is post-use. So in relation to those three ways of relating to the land, Africans had very limited rights. They had no rights of access, and they had no rights of exploitation of the land. And after the use of the land, they could be kicked out. The mandate that is given by Section 25 of the Constitution was that the ANC government, from the days of President Nelson Mandela, had to resolve the problem of limited tenure of rights of Africans over the land. Where Africans already had occupation rights, it had to strengthen those rights of occupation. Where they did not have occupation rights, it had to create new rights of occupation. Where they had no rights of exploitation, in other words, plowing and benefiting for the land, it had to create a dispensation to enable the benefit from the land. And in relation to post-use, in other words, when you are dead, where do you get buried? It had to create a regime in which it is possible for African people to claim burial space, in other words, post-life. Now, on those areas, there was an attempt in about 2010.
I want to come back to that, and I want us to expand on it, because this right to occupy debate we did touch on with you a couple of years ago, and where we are sitting about this RTO and whether people are still being given these RTOs. We'll continue with Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi in a moment. Stay with us. Back live with you tonight, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, still with us. He penned an opinion piece saying in his 17-page speech, President Cyril Ramaphosa devoted only one paragraph to explain the progress made by his government in achieving land reform. And he's saying, of course, there are a number of areas in which he needed to be answerable to us and maybe even to his own party as far as what he has achieved in the 5 years that he's been in office. So we spoke a couple of months ago around this question of right to occupy. And there was a feeling, especially around the people who live in the Gonyama Trust land, that no, they don't want this right to occupy because you can't really trade with this thing. It doesn't give you any right. You can't go to the bank and say, no, give me a loan in lieu of this, and so on and so forth. And there was a sense that there is conversation around getting rid of that dispensation. How far have we gone?
Not far, I'm afraid. In fact, we've gone backwards. Let me explain. In the 1960s, I think actually the regulation is a 1969 regulation. The apartheid government had experimented with various ways of giving tenure to Africans. It had moved from the British system where there was no tenure at all into some form of tenure. So the question was, we are not going to allow Africans rights of ownership in the form of title. So, but we need to find a mechanism in which Africans have a relationship with the land. And they introduced through the regulations under the Black Administration Act in 1969 this idea of a permission to occupy, PTO. It was widely applied in different guises across the country, in the Eastern Cape, in the KwaZulu-Natal, in Venda, everywhere where native people occupied land. They were given these pieces of paper. It was not ownership, but it was better than nothing. It gave certain rights of occupation, and it had two key features that were crucial. The first one was transmissibility. It could be transmitted. When you die, you could give it to your son. And of course, there was still a sexist problem with it. In other words, women were still excluded from the exercise of the rights under the PTO system. The second feature of the PTO was transferability. So both transmissible, in other words, it could be inherited, and transferable. In other words, it could be transferred laterally as well as vertically as well as horizontally. But those permissions to occupy continued to exist post 1994. So if you had a permission to occupy in 1993, despite the voting in April of 1994, you continued holding it. But there was a mandate under the Constitution that instrument, that piece of paper that you got at the Isibonda or at the headman had to be changed so that you are given more tangible rights. But the ANC government did nothing about those PTOs, nothing at all. The system just continued as it was before. In KwaZulu-Natal, reforms were introduced about 8 years ago. But those reforms were regressive, not progressive. Why? Because they chopped off the PTO system. They cut it off. What they replaced with was leasehold, not ownership, leasehold. What that meant is that they converted everybody who lived in those 2.8 million hectares of Ingonyama Trust into a tenant of the trust. Now, tenancy gave you even less secure rights than a PTO. Why? Under a tenancy, you had to pay rental. Under a tenancy, it could be terminated because you have committed a breach. Under a tenancy, there is an end date. And a tenancy lacks the two features of a PTO, transmissibility and transferability. And that is what led to the challenge that was brought by the communities to set aside the decision to do away with the PTOs and replace them with leasehold. So as matters stand, Thabo, I'm afraid to say that the old apartheid system continues to apply, and people find it very difficult to accept this. But it is true that 30 years later, the dispensation in the rural areas, in the communal areas, has not changed. In the wider South Africa, outside of the area of Ingonyama Trust, what the government tried to do was to introduce the Communal Land Rights Act. That was struck down by the Constitutional Court in 2010 because the government had not properly consulted with it, with the communities affected. But the problem with the Act, there were two fundamental problems with the Act. The first one was, in order for you to know what are the communal areas, you had to define the boundaries. And the boundaries that are defined in the Act were the boundaries inherited from apartheid, from the Black Administration Act. So in other words, they just replicated the apartheid boundaries. But the second problem was that the Act concentrated too much power over the control of the land to the chiefs, traditional authorities, which is also an apartheid and colonial inheritance coming from the 1927 Native Administration Act, which introduced what was generally referred to as a bifurcated state and indirect rule. So that act was declared unconstitutional. There is no new act as we speak. There is a draft policy which is meant to be converted into a draft bill and therefore a draft act. But that draft policy contains unconstitutional features, specifically because it takes away you and me's rights to occupy, exploit, and exercise after we are dead, rights over the land. And it concentrates the right on the chiefs.
I want us to touch then on the other issue that you are raising. So this has got to do then with the tenure of security. Restitution. You are saying that we've exhausted that. Is there no more claims now? This is the end of it as far as what needed to be claimed.
Yes. Now, restitution, people must remember that it's usually sometimes used in the same sentence. And I saw this was a flaw in the president's speech as well, that restitution is conflated with redistribution. These are two separate concepts under the Constitution. When we debate restitution, we are talking about the rights of people that were dispossessed from the 19th of June, 1913. So the reason why that's finished, it's done, is because there is a defined number of claims. There is a defined number of persons that lodged claims. And most importantly, there was a cut-off date. And that cut-off date was December of 1998. It came and it went. And it was extended under President Zuma's administration. But even that has now come and gone. So the reason why restitution is no longer a useful engine for land reform is because all of the claims that had to be made under the restitution programs have been made. There is no more land available under the restitution program. And this is why every time I hear government officials and politicians talk about restitution, it is a bit of a puzzle because restitution does not carry the prospect for the future. It is a backward-looking program to resolve a problem of forced removals. It is not a program to resolve the problem of South Africa, which is shortage of land.
Advocate, let's leave it there for tonight. Appreciate it, and thank you very much for your intervention tonight. Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi there penning a piece on Ramaphosa's speech, missing crucial issues on land reform. He's articulated some of them with us here tonight.